Welcome back to my channel, Celebes. Please share and subscribe and press the bell icon for new updates. George Harrison never yelled or got angry in public. He hardly ever got mad during interviews, but inside the Beatles, he had quiet anger that got worse over time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't something everyone could see, but it was real, and it hurt him personally. Under his calm and peaceful way of acting was anger that never went away. The quiet guy who felt left out. In the early 1960s, George Harrison was just a teenager riding a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They played guitar together, shared records, and both loved skiffle and rock music. McCartney was older, smarter, and spoke up more. George was quiet and easy to influence. He liked Paul's confidence and later liked John Lennon's smart idea. When he joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, in 1958, he was only 15 years old. Lennon first thought he was too young to be in the band. McCartney had to set up a second tryout on a bus where George impressed John by playing the main guitar part from a song called Raunchy. That moment opened the door to what would become the most famous band ever. But right from the start, George Harrison was walking into someone else's story. Lennon and McCartney controlled the band's early look and sound. They were the main songwriters. They made the plans. George just followed along. He learned from them. He watched and copied. And for a while, that was okay with him. As the Beatles became super famous, Harrison got the nickname the Quiet Beatle. The newspapers liked to write about how shy he was. But to people who knew him well, it was something heavier, a man who was starting to feel pushed aside and even choked by the situation. He had his own musical ideas. He had spiritual awakenings and new thoughts. But in the recording studio, his voice was too often drowned out by the others. When he suggested songs, they were passed over and ignored. When he offered guitar parts, they were questioned and changed. Paul, especially, who always wanted everything to be perfect, had a way of taking over everything. George would later say, "He ruined me as a guitar player." Not because Paul was mean, but from years of being quietly put down and made to feel small. The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just strong. It was like an empire inside the band. George wasn't just left out. He was left behind completely. And as the group changed and grew, the anger inside him began to get harder and stronger. What had started as looking up to them slowly turned into hate and anger, and no one made that fire burn more than Paul McCartney. The moment everything broke apart in the studio, by the time the Beatles began working on the White Album in 1968, George Harrison was no longer happy with being the silent helper who didn't speak up. He had grown as a songwriter, both in confidence and big dreams for his music. But inside the studio, things were getting more and more tense and difficult. The way they worked together had changed. Paul McCartney, who was driven and obsessed with every detail, had taken on the role of the leader without anyone officially saying so. John Lennon, often distracted by his new relationship with Yoko Ono, was getting more unpredictable and weird. George, he was done being overlooked and ignored. The recording sessions for Let It Be in early 1969 showed the cracks that had been building for years. Cameras rolled as the band tried to practice their songs, but what they captured was less working together and more quiet falling apart. One famous moment between George and Paul was caught on tape. Paul was trying to tell Harrison how to play his guitar part on the song, Two of Us. Getting frustrated, George pushed back with a calm but cutting line. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It wasn't sarcasm or being smart. It was giving up, a subtle white flag that said, "I'm not here to fight you, but I'm tired of this." To people watching from outside, it may have seemed like a small disagreement. But to those in the room, it was the end result of years of having his art suffocated and held back. Engineer Glyn Johns, who saw the Let It Be sessions with his own eyes, later described the feeling in the room as very unpleasant. The creative process had become a battlefield, and George, no longer willing to hold back his frustration, temporarily quit the band on January 10th, 1969. What made it worse was that Paul didn't seem to understand how serious what he was doing really was. He wasn't cruel or mean, just controlling and bossy. McCartney had a vision and plan, and he wanted everyone to follow it, even if it meant steamrolling over their ideas like a big truck. George had finally reached his limit and couldn't take it anymore. After coming back to the band a few days later under new rules and conditions, he began working on songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, masterpieces that proved what he was capable of when he was simply left alone to work. But the damage wasn't fixed or undone. The split between George and Paul had widened into something more permanent and lasting. And while George may have returned to the band, a part of him had already moved on emotionally. When friendship turned cold and distant, the Beatles officially broke up in 1970. But for George Harrison, the split wasn't just about work and business. It was deeply personal and hurt his feelings. While the newspapers focused on the fight between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Harrison was quietly cutting his own emotional ties, especially with Paul. The public saw polite interviews and staged reunions, but behind the scenes, George was struggling to let go of the anger and resentment that had been building for years. In 1971, Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a solo album filled with songs that had been rejected or pushed aside during his time with the Beatles. It was a creative and money-making success, and it didn't go unnoticed by his former bandmates. One track in particular, Wah Wah, stood out and got attention. On the surface, it sounded upbeat and happy, but the words were biting and mean. The title was a metaphor for the emotional noise and frustration George endured, and many people interpreted the song as a thinly veiled jab at Paul McCartney's domineering behavior. The bitterness and anger didn't stop there. In 1973, Harrison released Sue Me, Sue You Blues, another pointed commentary, this time about the legal battles that followed the breakup. While the song addressed the group as a whole, it was clear that much of his frustration was aimed at McCartney, who had started the lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership. That move, while necessary for business, felt like betrayal to Harrison. Not just because of the court drama, but because it cemented how far apart they had grown as friends. Even Harrison's ex-wife, Patty Boyd, later said that George never truly liked Paul's personality. She described how George would come home from recording sessions filled with anger, overwhelmed by the constant arguments, especially with Paul. They tolerated each other, she said, but I don't think they really loved each other. Professionally, they made brief attempts to work together again. In 1994, the surviving Beatles reunited for the Anthology project. But even then, old habits came back to the surface. George still found Paul difficult to work with. In private, he would roll his eyes at McCartney's suggestions, and Paul, ever the diplomat in public, admitted they still got on each other's nerves. Time had passed, but the wounds hadn't really healed or gotten better. A guitar silenced and held back. By the mid-1970s, George Harrison had already carved out a successful solo career, but the scars from his Beatles years still lingered and hurt, especially when it came to Paul McCartney. In a 1975 radio interview with Alan Freeman, George spoke honestly about something few had heard him admit out loud. I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul. It was a devastating statement, quiet but sharp and cutting. Coming from a man respected for his guitar work on songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the comment revealed how psychologically damaging those years under McCartney's influence had been. George wasn't saying Paul had done it on purpose to hurt him. What he meant was that the years of being overshadowed, second-guessed, and micromanaged had drained him of creative confidence. He'd spent too much time playing what someone else wanted and too little time being heard on his own terms. This internal conflict didn't just affect his playing. It affected how he viewed working with others. In the same time period, George confessed he would gladly join a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. Paul is a fine bass player, he said, but he's a bit overpowering at times. That wasn't meant as an insult. It was the reality of working with someone whose perfectionism often meant control over everything. For Harrison, the issue wasn't just about music. It was about space, about being allowed to grow and develop. And inside the Beatles, there had been very little space left for him to do that. That realization, painful and quiet, followed him long after the applause had faded and the crowds went home. Lennon, the wound that never closed or healed. While George Harrison's frustrations with Paul McCartney were more visible and obvious, his relationship with John Lennon was arguably more complex and, in many ways, more painful to deal with. In the early years of the Beatles, Harrison looked up to Lennon like a hero. John was older, sharp-witted, and fearless. George saw him not just as a bandmate, but as a mentor and teacher. Lennon, alongside McCartney, had helped shape Harrison's early songwriting, even encouraging him to experiment with structure and word writing. That sense of closeness, however, began to wear away as the years passed by. As Lennon became increasingly absorbed in his personal life, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono, George found himself emotionally shut out and ignored. John, who once took pride in his bond with George, grew distant and cold. And unlike McCartney's dominating studio presence, Lennon's indifference cut in a different way. He mocked Harrison's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality, treating it with sarcasm rather than curiosity. It hurt George's feelings. George had turned to meditation and Hindu philosophy as a way to find peace and identity. But from Lennon, he received little more than eye rolls and dismissive looks. The true depth of their separation became visible in George's 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine. In over 400 pages of personal reflection and memories, George barely mentioned Lennon at all. Fans noticed, and it wasn't an accident or oversight. The silence was a message in itself. Harrison later admitted that John could be a very difficult person and that their final years together were often cold and unfriendly. When Lennon was murdered in December 1980, the shock rattled George to his core and deeply affected him. But even then, his tribute was not full of nostalgia or sentimental feelings. Instead, Harrison expressed his grief through music, All Those Years Ago, a song that was both homage and subtle reckoning with their relationship. It remembered the early bond they had, yes, but it didn't pretend the pain had never happened or existed. In later interviews, Harrison spoke more softly about Lennon. While Paul grieved publicly and spoke warmly of George in interviews, the unspoken tension between them had never fully dissolved or gone away. The forgiveness, if it came, was quiet, incomplete, and perhaps one-sided. George Harrison left behind a legacy of music, spiritual searching, and quiet rebellion against authority. He had never been the loudest Beatle, but his pain was real, and his silence spoke volumes about what he felt. Through the decades, there had been admiration, there had been love, but there had also been bitterness and resentment. And in the end, there were some people George Harrison simply could never fully forgive, no matter how much time passed.